A waitress stopped someone from slapping the Mafia boss's mother. What happened next was massive. The hand was already in the air. Elena Vasquez saw it before anyone else did. She was carrying 2 plates of pasta across the dining room floor, threading between tables, not thinking about anything except whether table 7 needed more bread, when the sound hit her first. Chair scraping hard against tile. Then a voice, loud and ugly, cutting through the quiet hum of dinner conversation like a knife through paper. She turned. The man at table 9 was standing. His face was red, the kind of red that doesn't come from embarrassment, but from something much uglier. A night of too many drinks, and a pride that had taken too many hits. He was pointing at the older woman seated at the next table. His arm was raised, his palm was flat, and he was moving. Elena did not think. She put the plates down on the nearest surface. She would not remember exactly where. And she walked. 3 steps, maybe 4. She placed herself between the man's outstretched hand and the older woman's face. "Sir," she said. Her voice was calm, completely, almost unnaturally calm. "I am going to need you to sit back down right now." The man blinked. He hadn't expected anyone to move. He certainly hadn't expected a waitress in a black apron to be standing between him and the person he was about to reach. "You need to mind your business," he said. "This is my restaurant," Elena said. "Everyone inside it is my business." She wasn't shaking. That surprised even her, later, when she thought back on it. She was standing a foot away from a man who had a significant size advantage and a significant anger problem, and her hands were perfectly still. The 2 men who had been sitting quietly with the older woman rose from their chairs at the same time. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The man in red looked from them to Elena, and something in his chest deflated. "You're all insane," he muttered. He sat down. One of the 2 men said something to the manager in a voice too low to hear. 3 minutes later, the man at table 9 was being walked toward the door by 2 of the restaurant's staff, his unfinished drink left behind on the table, his coat still draped over the chair. Elena smoothed her apron. She picked up the plates she'd set down. She delivered them to table 7. "Sorry for the wait," she said, and smiled. That was how it started. That was the moment that changed everything, though Elena Vasquez had no idea of that while she was doing it. She was thinking about whether table 7 wanted pepper. She was thinking about the fact that her son, Oliver, had a school presentation in the morning, and she still needed to help him with it. She was thinking about the bus she needed to catch at 11:15. She was not thinking about the woman she had just protected. She didn't know the woman's name. She didn't know her story. All Elena knew, in the way that someone who has worked a busy restaurant for 6 years knows things, was that the older woman was the kind of person who arrived quietly and was served immediately, and that the 2 men with her never looked at the menu. They already knew what she would order. They'd been in situations like this before, sitting at a table, watching a room, and they'd developed the particular stillness of men who have learned to wait. Elena Vasquez had been working at Palazzo Romano since she was 23 years old. She had come in on the 2nd week after her husband left, filling out the application with Oliver on her hip, because there was no one to leave him with. The manager at the time, a tired man named George, had looked at her and the baby and the handwritten application, and he'd hired her on the spot. He told her later he'd needed someone who looked like they had something to prove. She did. 6 years later, she knew the restaurant the way she knew her own apartment. Every creak in the floor. Which tables had a wobble. Which regulars wanted their coffee before the menu, and which ones needed time. She knew the kitchen staff by the sounds they made when they were behind schedule. She knew when a couple at a corner table was on a first date versus a last one. She was good at reading rooms. It was the skill that kept her employed and kept her sane. It was also, on the particular Tuesday evening in late October, the skill that had made her eyes land on that raised hand, half a second before anyone else saw it. The older woman, she noticed as she passed by later that evening, had not made a scene. She had not cried or shaken, or called attention to what had just happened. She was sitting with the same straight back she'd had before, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes looking at the table. One of the 2 men had leaned down to speak to her softly, and she had waved him off with a single small gesture, the way people do when they want others to know they are completely fine and would rather not discuss it. When Elena brought the cannoli, she set it down gently. The older woman looked up at her, not with tears, not with the overstated gratitude that people sometimes perform after something frightening, just a clear, direct look, long and quiet. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," Elena said. "Can I get you anything else?" The woman smiled. "Just a small one." "No, we're fine." Elena nodded and moved on to the next table. She had 4 others to check on. The kitchen was backed up on one order. There was a birthday happening at table 12 that needed candles. She didn't think about the older woman again that night. Not really. She finished her shift. She counted her tips. Decent, not great. She changed out of her uniform in the back room and put on her coat. She caught the 11:15 bus. Oliver was asleep when she got home. She checked on him, the way she always did, standing in the doorway of his room for a moment in the dark. He was 8 years old, and he slept the way children sleep when they feel completely safe. Flat on his back, arms wide open, mouth slightly parted. She had worked very hard to make sure he felt that way. She closed his door softly and went to the kitchen. She made tea she didn't drink. She looked at the stack of bills on the counter that she dealt with on Saturdays. She thought about the man at table 9, the way his face had been, the particular kind of ugliness that comes out in people when they've had too much to drink and feel entitled to take it out on someone who seems smaller than them. She thought about the older woman's hands, the rings, the way she'd folded those hands in her lap and sat perfectly still. Then she went to bed. The next morning she helped Oliver with his presentation, a school project about rivers, and walked him to the bus stop, and watched the bus carry him away the way she did every morning. Then she walked back to the apartment, changed, and went to her shift. She thought nothing of it. She expected nothing from it. She had done what a decent person does when they see something wrong happening in front of them. She had stepped in. It had ended without anyone getting hurt. In her understanding of how the world worked, that was the end of the story. She was wrong. But she wouldn't know that for another 3 days. 3 perfectly ordinary days, during which she served pasta, and refilled water glasses, and helped Oliver with his homework, and paid the electricity bill, and worried quietly, the way she always worried, about money, and the future, and whether she was giving her son enough of everything he needed. 3 days of her regular life, the life she had built on shifts and tips and 6 years of remembering people's coffee orders and never ever calling attention to herself. Then the flowers arrived. They came on a Thursday morning, before the lunch rush. 24 white roses in a tall glass vase, carried in by a delivery man who handed them to the hostess and was gone before anyone thought to ask who sent them. There was no card, not a single word, just the flowers, white and perfect and out of place, sitting on the front desk of a mid-tier Italian restaurant in South Chicago. Elena stared at them for a long moment. She looked at the hostess, a young woman named Claire, who shrugged and said she had no idea. Elena looked at the flowers again. She went back to work. But that evening, after her shift, she got a phone call from her landlord. He sounded confused, slightly hesitant, like a man delivering information he didn't fully understand himself. He told her that her rent account had been settled, not just for the current month, for 3 months forward. Elena sat down on the bench in the back room, still in her uniform. "I don't understand," she said. "Neither do I," said her landlord. "But someone called my office today, and by this afternoon it was done." She sat there for a very long time after she hung up. The restaurant was winding down around her, the kitchen staff cleaning up, the last few tables paying their bills, the sound of dishes being stacked, the smell of cleaning product on tile. She didn't understand it. But somewhere, very quietly, in a part of her mind she didn't want to look at too directly, she was starting to. 3 days after the roses, Elena Vasquez was called into the office of her manager, a man named Gary who had been running Palazzo Romano for 4 years and who generally communicated with his staff through short sentences and a slightly pained expression. She had never been called into his office for anything except a scheduling conflict. She sat across from his desk and waited. Gary looked like a man who had been asked to do something he didn't fully understand and had decided his best option was to simply do it and not ask too many questions. "We're making you head waitress," he said. Effective Monday. Elena blinked. What? Head waitress. You'll have a pay increase. You'll manage the floor schedule. Gary, I haven't applied for anything. I know, he said. He looked at his desk. It's been decided. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He just looked at her with that pained expression, and she understood, without anyone saying it plainly, that the decision had not come from inside the restaurant. She walked out of his office slowly. She went to the floor. She did her shift. And that night, on the bus home, she let herself think the thought she had been carefully avoiding. The older woman at the restaurant, the white roses with no card, the rent paid 3 months ahead, the promotion that Gary could barely look her in the eye to deliver. She pressed her forehead against the cold window of the bus and looked out at the city lights moving past. She needed to know who that woman was. She asked Claire the next morning, casually, the way you ask about something that doesn't matter. Had those customers ever come in before? The older woman with the 2 men? Claire thought about it. A couple of times, maybe. They always call ahead. The reservation is always under Romano. Romano, Elena repeated. Like the restaurant, Claire said, and laughed a little, and went back to arranging menus. Elena stood still for a moment. Then she went to the back and took out her phone and searched the name she had been avoiding searching, the name she already somehow knew would be there. Cannavaro. She found it quickly. It was not hidden. These things never are, really. They exist in a particular layer of public record, newspaper archives, court documents from cases that ended without verdicts, articles written carefully by journalists who chose their words with obvious caution. Rosa Cannavaro, 74 years old, listed in several articles as the mother of Dominic Cannavaro, described in those same articles with the kind of language that means everything, without saying anything directly. A family with influence, a name with weight, a man, Dominic, who had been investigated and never charged, not because no one suspected anything, but because suspicion, in his world, never quite managed to become something a prosecutor could finish building. Elena put her phone in her pocket. She stood in the back hallway of the restaurant for a moment, between the kitchen and the storage room, listening to the sound of the city outside, the distant traffic, the ordinary sound of Tuesday morning. Then she washed her hands and went to start her shift. She didn't tell anyone what she'd found. She didn't call anyone. She went home that evening and made dinner and helped Oliver with his reading, and put him to bed and sat in the kitchen alone. The money was real. The promotion was real. The flowers had been real. She had stepped in front of a man's raised hand without knowing whose mother was sitting behind her. She had done it because it was the obvious thing to do, the only thing a person with any decency could do in that moment. And now, quietly, without anyone asking her permission, her life was being rearranged. She sat with that feeling for a long time. It was not simple. It was gratitude and discomfort, and something she didn't have a precise word for. The feeling of being seen, suddenly and completely, by someone whose attention carries enormous weight. She had spent 6 years being invisible. She had built that invisibility deliberately. It was safer, it was simpler, it cost less. And in 4 seconds, the 4 seconds it took her to cross a dining room floor and place herself between a man and an older woman, all of that had changed. She looked at the stack of bills on the counter. 3 months of rent, already covered. The number she'd been holding in her head, the number she returned to every night before she slept, was gone. Just gone. She didn't know how she felt about that. She didn't know how she felt about any of it. But the following Friday, a car arrived outside the restaurant at closing time, a dark one. A driver who said her name and nothing else, and something in Elena Vasquez, that same instinct that had sent her walking across a dining room without thinking, told her to get in. She got in. The car moved through the city quietly. She watched the streets change outside the window. She didn't ask where they were going. The driver didn't offer. The city slid past, the bright restaurants, the lit-up storefronts, the ordinary Friday night world, and after a while the car stopped in front of a building with no sign, a heavy door, and a man standing outside it who opened the door of the car before she'd fully decided to step out. She stepped out. She was taken through a hallway that smelled of leather and something warm, wood polish perhaps, or old books, and into a private room at the back. A table with 2 chairs, a glass of water already poured, and a man sitting across from it who stood up when she walked in. He was not what she expected. She had not let herself build a full picture, but whatever half-formed image she'd been carrying dissolved the moment she saw him. He was shorter than she'd imagined, heavier. He had the face of someone who had once been handsome and had spent too many years indoors. His suit was excellent. His hands, when he extended one toward her, were the hands of a man who had spent a lot of time at desks. "Miss Vasquez," he said, "please sit down. Thank you for coming." His voice was quiet, controlled, the voice of a man who has never needed to be loud to be heard. She sat. He sat. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and in that silence she understood that this was a man who was not often uncertain about what to say, and that right now, he was. "My name is Dominic Cannavaro," he said. "Rosa is my mother." "I know," Elena said. He nodded, as if he'd expected that. "I want to thank you for what you did." "I did what anyone would have done," Elena said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "They wouldn't." He said it without bitterness and without drama. Just a simple statement from a man who had spent his life surrounded by a particular kind of people and knew, with complete certainty, that what Elena had done was not, in fact, what most people would have done. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have found something urgent on the other side of the room to attend to. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I want you to know that whatever you need," he said, "you only have to say it." She thought about that for a moment. The rent, the promotion, the flowers. "You've already done things," she said. "Small things," he said. "They weren't small to me," she said honestly. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "Anything at all?" She considered it. Truly considered it. The way she might consider whether to accept something being offered by a stranger on the street, turning it over, checking its weight, thinking about what accepting it meant. "I don't think so," she said. "But thank you." He was quiet for a long moment. She had the impression that this was not a response he received often, that people, in her position, generally had a list ready. "You can leave any time you want," he said. "The car will take you home." "I know," she said. She stood. He stood. He shook her hand again, and this time she noticed that his grip was careful, deliberate, not aggressive, the handshake of a man reminding himself to be gentle. She left. The car took her home. She paid the babysitter, her neighbor's teenage daughter, who watched Oliver on the evenings she was asked to work late, and checked on her son, who was asleep again in that wide-open, trusting way of his. She stood in his doorway for a long time. She thought about what Dominic Cannavaro had said, that most people would not have done what she did. Maybe he was right. She didn't know. She had only done what made sense to her in the moment, moved by something she wouldn't call courage. She would resist that word for a long time, but something closer to an inability to stand still while something wrong happened in front of her. She had always been that way. It had gotten her into trouble before, in smaller situations, over smaller things. A coworker being treated unfairly. A customer being cruel to someone who couldn't respond. She had always stepped in. It had always seemed like the only available option. She went to bed. In the morning, Oliver asked her why she was smiling. She hadn't realized she was. "Just thinking," she told him. He studied her with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old who suspects he is not getting the full story. "Okay," he said, and went back to his cereal. She watched him eat. She thought about the word Dominic had used. "Whatever you need." She turned it over in her mind all morning. She thought about Oliver's school, the public one 3 blocks away, where the classrooms were crowded, and the building needed work, and his teacher was good but overwhelmed. She thought about the small business idea she'd been carrying around for 2 years, the catering concept she'd sketched out in notebooks she kept in the drawer beside her bed, the idea she'd never let herself believe was possible. She thought about the loan she'd applied for twice and been denied twice, and the third application she hadn't started because she already knew the answer. She thought about all of it, and she thought about what it meant to want things from a man like Dominic Cannavaro. It was not a simple question. She knew that. She had no illusions about who he was or what his family's name represented. She was not naive, and she was not the kind of woman who simplified things to make them easier to swallow. The money that had arrived in her landlord's account, the car, the private room, none of it existed in a simple world. But Oliver was real. His school was real. The notebooks in her drawer were real. She sat with it. She would keep sitting with it. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived. Not to her apartment, to the restaurant, addressed to her by name, sealed and formal. Inside was a single sheet of paper with information about a scholarship program she had never heard of. It said that her son, Oliver Vasquez, age 8, had been selected for full enrollment at Westfield Academy, a private school on the north side, beginning the following term. All fees covered. Uniforms, books, transportation. She read it twice at the back table on her break. She thought about calling someone to ask how this had happened, then decided that calling was unnecessary. She knew how it had happened. She sat there with the letter in her hands, and she thought about Oliver sleeping with his arms wide open, and she thought about the older woman with the folded hands and the clear eyes and the small smile. She thought about what decent people do. Then she folded the letter carefully, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to work. 4 months after the Tuesday evening that started everything, the Palazzo Romano was a different place. Not in the way a renovated building is different, not in any way that could be photographed or pointed to, but in a way that people who pay attention could feel when they walked through the door. The reservations had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a tide changes, quietly, and then all the way. Certain names appeared on the booking sheet that Gary, the manager, handled with a particular carefulness, confirming the times twice, and making sure the corner booth was always available. The average tip on those tables was a different category of number than what Elena had grown used to counting at the end of a shift. Her income, across the span of a single season, had quietly doubled. She didn't speak about it to anyone at work. She didn't need to. Claire, the hostess, had figured out something was different, without needing it explained. The kitchen staff could sense it in the way the room felt on certain evenings, a particular attentiveness, a low-level awareness that the people in the corner booth mattered, in ways that went beyond restaurant logic. Elena moved through all of it with the same steadiness she had always had. She remembered coffee orders. She refilled water glasses. She smiled at people and meant it. She did not perform anything. She did not pretend that the evenings when certain guests arrived were ordinary, but she also did not treat them as extraordinary. She served everyone with the same care she had always given, and somehow this, the simple consistency of it, was what people noticed most. Oliver started at Westfield Academy on a Monday morning in early February. She walked him to the gate herself. The building was large and well-maintained, with grounds that his previous school could not have imagined. He was wearing the uniform, navy and white, and he had his backpack on and his lunch in a bag, and he looked, in that moment, like the most serious 8-year-old person she had ever seen. He looked up at the school. Then he looked up at her. "It's big," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Will I know anyone?" "You will," she said. "You're good at that." He considered this information, decided it was accurate, and walked through the gate. She stood outside for a moment. The morning was cold, the sky the flat white of a winter morning, her breath visible in the air. She watched him walk up the path toward the entrance, his backpack slightly too large for him, his steps deliberate and careful. She turned and walked to the bus stop. She thought, on the bus, about her notebooks, the catering idea, the third loan application she had not started. She thought about what she wanted. She had spent so long thinking about survival that want had become a foreign language. She spoke it roughly, without confidence, the way you speak a language you learned from books without ever having lived in the country. She knew the words but not the accent. She knew what things were called without knowing how they felt. She wanted the catering company. She had always known she wanted it. She just had not believed that want was allowed to become a plan. 3 days later, she called the number on the loan application she had failed twice. She filled it out a third time, carefully, in her neat handwriting, the way she did everything, with attention, without shortcuts. She submitted it. The approval came back in 4 days. The loan officer called her personally. His voice had the quality she had begun to recognize in certain phone calls and certain interactions. A slight extra care, a slightly elevated helpfulness, as if someone had quietly rearranged the air in the room before she arrived. She thanked him. She hung up. She opened her notebooks. She had sketched the concept in pieces, over 2 years of late nights at the kitchen table while Oliver slept. A catering service focused on private events, built on the cooking she had learned from her grandmother. Real food, made properly, served by people who understood what it meant to take care of a room. Not fancy in the way of pretension, but careful in the way of quality. She knew food. She knew service. She knew people. She started building it. She hired her first employee in March, a woman from the restaurant, a cook named Paula who had been underpaid and overlooked for 3 years, and who, when Elena offered her a job, stood in the kitchen and cried quietly for about 30 seconds before pulling herself together and asking about the salary. Elena told her the number. Paula looked at her. "That's real?" "That's real," Elena said. They shook on it. The business grew slowly, and then faster, the way things grow when they are built right. First a few events, then word of mouth, then a reputation that arrived before them when they walked into rooms. Elena managed every detail herself. She was at every event. She knew every client's preferences. She remembered what people ate, and what they didn't, and what they asked for, and what they couldn't quite explain but wanted, and she gave them all of it. She was good at reading rooms. She had always been good at that. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something that had not been planned and could not have been engineered. Something that was, in Elena's private estimation, the most surprising development of everything that had followed that Tuesday evening. Rosa Cannavaro had started coming back to Palazzo Romano. Alone. No men with quiet eyes at the table beside her, just Rosa herself, arriving at 7 in the evening, settling into the corner booth, ordering a small pasta and still water, and a cannoli she never fully finished. She came every 2 weeks, then every week. She always sat in Elena's section, though the restaurant was small enough that this required no special arrangement. They talked. Not about anything significant, at first. Rosa asked about the restaurant. Elena asked about Rosa's garden, which Rosa mentioned once and then returned to in almost every subsequent conversation. The way people return to the things that anchor them. Rosa had a garden behind her house. She grew tomatoes and herbs, and a particular variety of rose that her own mother had grown before her. She spoke about it with a precision and a care that suggested it was the place where she went when the rest of life became too heavy. Elena listened. She was good at listening. It was another skill she'd developed over 6 years of standing beside tables, hearing the things people said, and the things they meant under what they said. She heard, in Rosa's careful descriptions of her garden, a woman who had spent a very long time surrounded by noise and had found one quiet place to exist in. The conversations deepened. Not all at once. The way trust deepens, incrementally, over repeated small moments of honesty, until one evening you find yourself saying something true that you hadn't planned to say. Rosa asked about Oliver one evening. Elena told her about the school, about his reading, about the way he had made 3 friends in his first week, and come home each evening with more energy than he'd left with. Rosa listened with her hands folded on the table, and a look on her face that Elena could not immediately name. Then Rosa said, very quietly, that she had 3 grandchildren she had not seen in 4 years. Elena didn't ask why. She just nodded. Rosa looked at the table. "Things become complicated," she said. "When you love someone whose life is complicated, the love does not become less, but everything around it becomes very difficult." Elena thought about that for the rest of the shift. 2 weeks later, during one of their conversations, Rosa mentioned that her health had not been good. She said it matter-of-factly, without seeking sympathy, in the way that people who have been unwell for some time eventually develop, a flatness around the fact of it, the way you develop flatness around anything you have already made peace with. Elena looked at her. "How serious?" she asked. Rosa smiled. Small, clear. The same smile from that first evening. "Serious enough," she said. Elena reached across the table and put her hand over Rosa's. Rosa looked down at their hands. She did not pull away. She sat with it for a moment, and then she looked up, and the expression on her face was one Elena would carry with her for a long time. Not grief, exactly. Not gratitude, exactly. But something that contained both of them, and something else besides. "You are an unusual person, Elena," Rosa said. "I'm very ordinary," Elena said. "No," said Rosa, "you are not." They sat like that for a while. The restaurant moved around them, the sound of other tables, the kitchen, the ordinary music of an evening service, and the two of them were still inside it, the older woman and the younger one, holding something between them that neither of them had expected, and that both of them needed. The interviewer arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late autumn, almost exactly 1 year after the Tuesday evening that had started everything. She was a researcher for a community welfare organization that documented the experiences of working women in Chicago. Their challenges, their decisions, the moments that changed their paths. Her name was Laura, and she had short dark hair, and a recording device she set on the table between them, with a quiet confidence that Elena recognized as the mark of someone who had sat across from many different kinds of people and learned how to make them comfortable. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the restaurant. Elena had suggested it. Neutral territory, she thought, though she didn't fully analyze why that mattered to her. Laura had done some research. Elena could tell. She knew about the restaurant, about the incident the previous October, the bare facts of it, a disturbance, a confrontation, a waitress who stepped in. She had not been able to find much more than that. Some stories resist being made into records. "I want to understand what that moment felt like," Laura said, from the inside. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "It didn't feel like anything dramatic," she said. "It felt like the obvious thing, like something was falling and I caught it." Laura wrote something down. "Were you frightened?" "After," Elena said. "Not during." "Why do you think that is?" Elena considered it. "I think during the moment itself, I was just solving a problem. There wasn't room for anything else." She paused. "Fear is what happens when you have time to think. I didn't have time." They talked for 2 hours. Elena told her about working at the restaurant for 6 years, about Oliver and school and the catering business, about what it had taken to build something for herself while taking care of a child alone. She was direct and she was honest, and she chose her words with the same care she gave to everything. She did not talk about Dominic Cannavaro. She did not talk about Rosa. She spoke around those parts of the story the way you speak around something that belongs to you privately. Not hiding it, exactly, but not offering it either. Some things are not yours to share. Some things were given to you in trust and you keep them. Laura noticed. Elena could see her noticing. But Laura was a good interviewer, and she understood the shape of what was not being said without pressing on it. Near the end of their conversation, Laura asked a question that Elena had not expected. "Do you think you're brave?" she asked. Elena was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I think I'm someone who can't stand still when something wrong is happening." "Is there a difference?" Elena thought about it. "Brave people feel the fear and do it anyway," she said. "I didn't feel the fear until it was over. I just moved. That's not bravery. That's just being unable to choose otherwise." Laura looked at her for a moment. "Some people would say that's the definition of character," she said. Elena smiled. Not the professional smile she'd built for tables and guests and managers. The real one. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I just had nowhere else to be." They finished their coffee. Laura packed up her recorder. At the door of the coffee shop, Laura paused. "One more thing," she said. "The woman at the restaurant. The older woman you protected. Did you ever think about what you were risking? If the situation had been different, if those men had reacted badly?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "And?" Elena pulled on her coat. "And I stepped in anyway," she said. "Because she was a person, and she needed someone to step in." She said goodbye to Laura and walked out into the autumn afternoon. The city was doing what cities do in late October, pulling on its winter colors, the leaves turning, the light going golden and lower each day. She walked the 3 blocks to Palazzo Romano, nodding at Claire on her way in, checking the floor for the evening ahead. There were 18 reservations. One of them, at 7 o'clock, in the corner booth, was under the name Romano. Elena smiled. She tied on her apron. She went to work. The call came on a Thursday evening in late November. It was Dominic's number. She had it now, stored in her phone with no name attached. And when she answered, she knew before he spoke what kind of call it was. People who have learned to carry large things know the particular silence at the start of a call like that. Rosa had passed in her sleep the night before. He told her quietly. His voice was what she would describe, later, as controlled in the way that water is controlled behind a dam. Everything there, everything held. She said she was sorry. She meant it in the fullest possible way. She had never said she was sorry, and meant it more. He thanked her. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said that in the last months of his mother's life, Rosa had spoken about Elena more than almost anyone else. That something about their conversations, their simple, quiet, restaurant table conversations about gardens and children and the ordinary weight of living, had given Rosa something she had been missing for a long time. She had felt, Dominic said, like herself, not like his mother, not like a name that carried the gravity his name carried, but like a woman who had a garden and a history and things worth talking about over a small pasta and still water. Elena stood in her kitchen with the phone to her ear and felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name. She was a remarkable person, Elena said. Yes, said Dominic, she was. There was a long pause. She asked that you be there, he said, at the service, if you were willing. Elena closed her eyes. Of course, she said. The service was small, private, a room with flowers and quiet music, and people who sat with the particular stillness of those who grieve in dignified ways, because they have had practice. Elena sat near the back. She wore a dark dress she had bought the morning before, the kind of purchase made quickly and practically, chosen for its simplicity. Dominic stood at the front. He spoke about his mother with a care and precision that told Elena everything she needed to know about what Rosa had meant to him, which was everything she understood. Beneath everything, beneath the weight of his name and his world and all of it, Rosa had been the fixed point, the person who had seen him as her son first and everything else second. Elena sat quietly and listened. Afterward, in the entrance hall, Dominic came to her. He shook her hand again, that careful, deliberate handshake. Thank you for being here, he said. Thank you for asking me, she said. He looked at her for a moment. In his face, she could see the loss. Not hidden, just present, the way people allow their loss to be visible in rooms where it is safe to. She liked you very much, he said. I liked her, Elena said. I liked her enormously. He nodded. He looked away for a moment. I hope you know, he said, that if you ever need anything. I know, Elena said, and I'm fine. He looked at her with something that might have been respect, and something else she didn't have a word for. You're always fine, he said. No, she said honestly, but I usually manage. He almost smiled. Then someone came to speak to him, and he turned away, back into the machinery of his life, and Elena put on her coat and went outside. The November air was cold and clean. She stood on the steps for a moment, looking at the street, at the city she had lived in her entire life, the city that had asked a lot from her, and given back slowly and unevenly, and sometimes not at all. She thought about Rosa's garden, the tomatoes and herbs, the roses that had been her mother's before they were hers. She thought about a woman who had spent her last months talking about simple things with another woman across a restaurant table, and how that had been, according to her son, who did not seem like a man who said things he didn't mean, exactly what she needed. She thought about the evening a year ago, the raised hand, the 4 steps across the floor, the words she'd said to a man who hadn't expected to be stopped. She walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk. Oliver was at school. The catering company had an event on Saturday. She had a shift on Friday and needed to rearrange the floor schedule. She had a grocery list in her head and a phone call to return and a new notebook she'd started for the next phase of the business. She had things to do. She had a life that had, in the span of a year, changed so significantly that it was almost impossible to map the distance between where she'd been and where she was standing now. And yet, She was still the same person who had put down 2 plates of pasta and walked across a dining room because something was about to happen that shouldn't. She was still the person who couldn't choose otherwise. That had not changed, and she suspected it never would. A year later, when Laura's article was published by the organization, it included one line from Elena that the editor had underlined in the draft as the line the piece should close on. Elena had said it at the very end of their conversation, almost as an afterthought, pulling on her coat, already half out the door. I didn't save anyone that night. I just didn't let something wrong happen in front of me. I've always done that. The difference is, this time, someone noticed. The city went on around her, ordinary and enormous, full of people trying to build something in the spaces they were given. Elena Vasquez walked home. She had things to do.